All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. Today, let me share my screen with you real quick. We are covering my favorite chapter, social psychology. So I'm a social psychologist by training, so I'm a little bit biased, but uh, of all the different subfields of psychology, this one is really uh, just so relevant and applicable to everyone's daily lives. It covers everything from conformity, obedience to authority, um, liking, loving, like how to fall in love, prejudice, you name it. A lot of really, really timely topics. So let's dive right in. So let's start off with the definition for your notes. What is social psychology? And formally, it's how people think about other people and interact in relationships and groups. Social psychologists often think of themselves as studying kind of social cognition, which is a fancy way of saying how people kind of think about the world around them. Everything from like impression formation, just being curious about how other people are viewing you and how you're viewing yourself and your self-esteem. So part of it is social cognition, how you think about other people. The other part of it is social influence. So everything from persuasion to conformity to compliance and obedience, things like that. And the last part is social relationships. So everything from helping or why people fail to help other people in times of need, to liking and loving and attraction and intimacy and belonging, all the wonderful things that draw people together and cause them to fall in love. Um, uh, Paired with the dark side of relationships, aggression and hatred and prejudice and discrimination and negative stereotypes. So, in short, think of social psychology about how people are thinking about and interacting and relating to the people around them, for better or for worse. So, let's first start off talking about kind of social cognition, specifically about people's attitudes and behaviors. And of all the different topics covered within social psychology, the one that's probably garnered the most attention is attribution. And you may not use that word attribution a lot, but it really refers to is why. Why are people doing the things that they're doing? And I know I asked myself that some questions about my own family members, my friends, like why in the world would you do that? And people's answer are like, oh, I did it because it's their attribution. And what you find time after time again, even in other countries besides the United States and even European countries, you find that people commit the same kind of attribution mistake. They call this the fundamental attribution error, which in short is our tendency to attribute other people's actions to their personalities. So, for instance, when you're walking across, let's say, well, prior to living in California, I used to live in Indianapolis, which, for those of you that don't know, it snows and it freezes and there's ice on the ground. And I would frequently walk across campus and I would just slip, just completely eat it, right? When you see someone else slip, you're like, oh, that person is clumsy, right? You make an attribution based on their personality, right? Their disposition, they're a clumsy person. But if you're the one that slips, it's like, oh, I slipped because there's a wet spot right here. Or I slipped because my shoes don't have a whole lot of grip. Or I slipped because I was being distracted because my phone was vibrating in my pocket. Someone was calling me at this exact same time that I made a step. Notice that difference in attribution. You slipped because of all of the situational things that you're aware of. But when you see someone else slip, it's because they're clumsy. We do this exact same thing in traffic, right? If someone is like tailgating you, they're riding your bumper. Why, right? What is your attribution? Why are they riding your bumper? Probably the first thing that came to your mind is probably something that's not very nice, right? Probably not a word that I want to be recorded using on YouTube right now, but something like this person's a jerk, right? Notice how when they're tailgating, they're a jerk. But have you ever tailgated? Well, of course. Like I was tailgating because I was in a rush to class, or I was tailgating because I needed to get to the hospital, or I was tailgating because it was a really good song on the radio and I was like jamming out, wasn't paying attention. Notice how when you're tailgating, it's because of the situation, but when someone else is tailgating, it's because they're a jerk or they're aggressive or something like that, right? That's the fundamental attribution error that we blame or we attribute other people's behavior to their dispositions about who they are. The same way when you're like at Starbucks, right? And you see someone yelling about their order. Why is that person yelling at that poor barista? Well, that person might be aggressive or hostile or angry, and like we blame their personality. But when we get angry and we yell, it's because we're tired. It's because we're frustrated. It's because something else, like we blame the situation. That sort of asymmetry where we blame other people's behavior, blame it on their personality, where we take the situation into account for ourselves, that asymmetry is referred to as the fundamental attribution error. And the reason why the attribution error has been talked about so much is because it makes a whole lot of difference on whether you forgive somebody, for instance, right? Social psychologists have also looked at attitudes and behavior and when they don't always align. So people like to think that their attitudes predict their behaviors, but not always, right? There's certainly situations where we say one thing and do another. To really get at this kind of messy middle of like, what happens when your attitudes and behaviors don't always align? What does that do to people? There's a famous social psychologist named Leon Festinger, and what he decided to do is join a cult. I kid you not. Leon Festinger, a social psychologist, decided to join a cult. And what he wanted to do is see what would happen if the cult that he joined was very vocal in saying that the world was going to end this upcoming Friday night at midnight. And they were putting ads in the newspaper, and they were telling people to drop out of school, sell your house, quit your job. Like, you don't need it anymore. The world's going to end. So Leon Festinger wanted to go there, join the cult, and see what happens when everyone's behavior is diehard, about to join this cult, expecting the world to end. What's going to happen when they're sitting there and their attitude expecting the world to end and it doesn't? So if they expect the world to end at midnight, what happens at 12:01, at 12:05, when their behavior is, I'm sitting here and I'm devoted, and their attitude is saying, well, maybe this is a con and maybe I got tricked and fooled? What's going to happen when their attitudes and behaviors don't align? And what Leon Festinger did is he joined that cult. He convinced them that he had sold his house and dropped out of work, and he was there at midnight. He was there early. And the whole time he was sitting in the back just kind of taking notes. And what Leon Festinger noticed at 11:55, people were excited, right? They thought that the world was going to end and they were going to be saved by aliens from the planet Clarion. I kid you not. The members of this cult thought that at midnight, aliens from the planet Clarion were going to swoop down, beam them up into their spaceship and save them and destroy the rest of the world with this massive flood. What happened at 11:55, everyone's there, everyone's excited. At midnight, it is silent. Everyone's just waiting for these aliens from the planet Clarion to come, and they didn't come. At 12:05, it's still been silence for like 5 minutes straight, and they're just waiting. Someone in the back looks at their watch and says, oh, yeah, like, maybe it's not 12:05 yet. Maybe my watch is just fast. And they all agree, oh, yeah, totally. Maybe we're just 5 minutes early. Let's keep waiting. Hours go by. 4 hours go by, and it's silent. No one is saying anything. They're sitting there. Their behavior is, I am here. I'm ready for the world to end. I'm ready to be beamed up. And their attitude is, this isn't going to happen. Maybe I was lied to. Maybe my attitude and behaviors aren't aligning. And people started crying. They started breaking down. And the leader of this group takes a step back. She goes into another room, and then she comes back an hour later and rejoices to everybody and says, hey, thank you guys for showing up and being so devoted. I just got this message beamed into my brain from these aliens from the planet Clarion. And they told me, because you were here early and you were so devoted and so devout in this belief, that they've decided to spare the entire world. Because of your belief in this, how devout you were, they decided to spare everyone else in the entire world. And the place just went nuts. People are cheering and high-fiving and clapping and like hugging each other. And Leon Festinger, the social psychologist, is sitting in the back saying, what the hell just happened, right? You guys were here for the last 4 hours, like on the brink of tears. Your behavior and your attitudes weren't aligning. You're sitting in this seat, but your attitude saying maybe this was a sham. And you're feeling that sort of like uncomfortable feeling when your attitudes and behaviors don't align. But notice what happened, right? All of a sudden they change their attitudes, they change their explanation. So now it aligns with their behavior and they feel great. So the next morning, on Monday morning, Leon Festinger goes back to campus and says, I need to test this. I need to test what happens when people experience what's called cognitive dissonance, when their attitudes and behaviors don't align. I want to try and recreate that in a laboratory setting and see what happens. So Leon Festinger and his colleague, Carl Smith, created the most boring psychology study of all time. I kid you not. They created the most boring psychology study of all time about the effect of expectatory beliefs, or the effect of anticipatory beliefs on performance, something like that. And what they would do is they would bring participants into the lab. You have a college student participant over here, and you have the research assistant over here. They would bring the research assistants into lab and say, hey, today we're going to be doing a study on your performance for the next hour. What I want you to do is look at these wooden blocks on this board in front of you. And I want you to go and turn each block a quarter turn to the right. And keep doing that, block by block, just a quarter turn at a time, over and over and over again for an hour straight. It was an incredibly boring study, right? I mean, imagine if you or I were in that study. We would hate it, right? It would be so incredibly boring. So after the study was over, what Leon Festinger did is he went up to these participants and he said, okay, great. Thank you for participating in this hour-long study where you turn those knobs over and over and over again. The whole point of this study is to see what sort of like expectations people have going into it. And if they expect it to be like a really fun and engaging task, will they perform better? So what Leon Festinger did is he asked all the participants, hey, normally the next researcher that kind of comes in, the next research assistant that like gives the spiel and tells the next group of participants how fun and exciting this study is, he called out sick. Would you do me a favor? Would you go to the next group of participants about to start this study and lie to them, right? Go to them and say how fun and exciting this study is. But you know how incredibly boring it truly is. And in one condition, right, for half of the participants, Leon Festinger asked them, hey, would you go and lie to these participants and tell them how fun and exciting the study is? I'll pay you $1 to do so. In the other condition, they said, hey, would you go and basically lie to these participants and tell them how fun and exciting this study is? I'll pay you $20. And then after, so everyone agreed, everyone took the money, everyone agreed, everyone went up and told the next group of participants, hey, this study's really fun. Like, you know, it's kind of like a puzzle. You don't really know what's going to happen, but I didn't figure it out, but maybe you'll have better luck. It's really fun and exciting study. Everyone lied to these next group of participants. And then afterwards, Leon Festinger pulled those people that just lied off to the side and said, okay, honestly, between you and me, on a 1 to 7 scale, how much did you really enjoy this study? And this is where I would normally pause. And if you want to hit the pause button right now, great. And think about what group of participants do you think would really enjoy that task more, that found it like a really interesting study? The group that was paid $1 or the group that was paid $20? So hit pause right now, give me your guess. And let me show you what the results were. And they probably weren't the way that you expected. Most of you I've surveyed students semester after semester by describing the study and then asking them their results. And without fail, the vast majority of participants say, well, if you give someone 20 bucks, they'll enjoy the class, enjoy the task more, right? They'll enthuse over it more. They'll find it more interesting if you pay them more. But what Leon Festinger found, it was the exact opposite. If you pay people $1 to lie, to tell the next group of participants how fun and exciting the study was, then when you pull them aside and say, honestly, how did you really feel? They actually report enjoying the study more. It's so backwards, right? It's so counterintuitive to what people think. Why? What's going on? And Leon Festinger created cognitive dissonance theory, which does a really good job of explaining why people enthuse about really dull tasks like this when they are only paid $1. And if you put yourself in the participant's shoes here, imagine you got paid $20. And this was an old study, kind of 50 plus years ago. $20 went a long way, right? That was a lot of money. You privately know that this study sucked. It was incredibly not interesting at all. And you just lied and you told people, yeah, it's fun, it's exciting. And you're thinking to yourself, why did I do that, right? My attitude is this study sucks, but my behavior is I'm telling people how fun and exciting it is. That should create some sort of uncomfortable feeling, right? Some sort of dissonance that people would be motivated to reduce, right? And then when you ask those participants, hey, why did you do that? Why did you lie? Why did your behavior say this was fun when your private attitude was this sucks? And they're like, oh, I got paid $20. That's sufficient justification, right? It's enough money that I can justify why I lied. It's like, yeah, like, my attitude behavior didn't align, but hey, I got paid 20 bucks for it. But what about the folks in the $1 condition? Those folks, their attitude and behaviors don't align, right? They're lying. They're saying, yeah, the study's really fun and exciting. And they knew their private attitude is this study really sucked. And they're like, why am I doing this? Why am I experiencing this cognitive dissonance? My attitudes and behaviors aren't aligning. Was it because I've been paid? Well, I wasn't being paid enough, right? It was only $1. Is that enough to justify why my attitudes and behavior weren't aligning? And the answer is no. For those folks that were only paid $1, they didn't have like sufficient justification to rationalize why they were lying. They experienced a lot of uncomfortable, a lot of dissonance when their attitude and behavior didn't align. So what happened is they changed their attitude. They said, well, you know what? The study really was fun. It really was that great. I really did enjoy it. And they convinced themselves, right? They changed their attitude in a way that aligned with their private behavior. And we see the same thing happen in society today over and over and over again. You do this, I do this. So a formal definition for your notes. What is cognitive dissonance theory? Cognitive dissonance theory is a mismatch between people's attitudes and behavior that creates dissonance that they're motivated to reduce. So when people's attitudes and behaviors don't align, it makes them feel uncomfortable, right? What happens when you're dating someone that is treating you really poorly and you're like, I don't like this person, right? What happens if your attitude and behavior don't align? You can change your behavior and say, you know what, we're done. And you break up with that person, right? Or you can change your attitude and say, well, like, she's not that bad. Or, the relationship's not that bad. It was a joke. It was just taken, out of context or whatever. And you change your attitude to kind of justify why you've been in this really kind of bad or abusive relationship. Or you just kind of forget about it and you ignore the inconsistency between the two. And according to cognitive dissonance theory, is the people that are going to experience the most dissonance are the ones that chose to be in that relationship with someone that they didn't like. You chose to date this person and they're treating you poorly, and you know that you can do better than this. You know that you're a good person and your attitude about yourself doesn't align with the way this person's treating you. If you choose to experience this attitude, behavior, inconsistency, that should create the most dissonance that you're motivated to reduce. And imagine, let's say someone's paying you $1,000 to date this person. You're like, well, I'm getting paid $1,000. Of course, I'm okay with this inconsistency because I can justify it. $1,000 is sufficient justification. But for most of us, right, we aren't getting paid to date anybody. So it's like, wait, I chose to date this person. I'm not getting paid at all. There's insufficient justification of attitude and behavior is not aligning. Those people should experience the most motivation to change their attitudes. And you see this. I think you unfortunately see this why some people in domestic violence situations where their friends and family come up to them and say, hey, like, you don't deserve this. You're a good person. You know, God loves you. I love you. Like, what are you doing letting someone treat you this way? Shouldn't that create cognitive dissonance? Most of us, right, would leave, change our behavior, but not everybody, right? There are some people that say, well, like, I actually deserve it, and I'm not as great as you think I am. And they change their attitude about themselves to alleviate the dissonance that was created by that abusive relationship. On a much brighter note, thank God that the US military uses cognitive dissonance theory, right? They get people to enlist in the military, and they make basic training hard as hell, right? You get in there and it's like, hey, remember that haircut that you really loved? We're shaving that off. Remember all those clothes that you used to really, you know, love and used to give you all that like individual personality and swag and all that cool stuff? Nope, you aren't allowed to wear those clothes anymore. You have to wear this uniform. And you know how you used to really love sleeping in? We're not doing that. We're getting up early and we're going to run 10 miles. And then we're going to do 1,000 push-ups. And then after you're exhausted, we're going to take a 15-minute lunch and then we're going to do it all over again. And you have some people going through basic training and they're like, I am working my butt off here. I'm running mile after mile after mile. I'm getting up early. I'm doing push-ups. And their attitude is, I hate this. Why am I doing this, right? I don't like, you know, feeling all this pain. My attitude towards this is negative, but my behavior is I'm still doing it. And I chose to do this. I wasn't drafted. I volunteered to be part of the military. Those people experience cognitive dissonance, right? So what do? Some drop out. They change their behavior and say, nope, not for me. But not most. The other folks change their attitude, right? And they say, no, like, let me change my attitude to be consistent with my behavior. And they start saying, well, like, the reason why I'm doing this is because the US military is so incredibly important. And it's so incredibly important for our freedom and to protect my family's freedom and the country's freedom that, like, I need to have this sort of discipline and I need to be loyal and I need to do this. And they become, you know, the best of the best soldiers that we have, incredibly loyal, because they change their attitudes to match that behavior. Say, yeah, like, this is worthwhile. And become even more extreme in their pro attitudes towards the military afterwards, right? It's no surprise that, like, you have all these former Army soldiers and Marines coming back, you know, tattooing Semper Fi and getting stickers and, like, having this as such a strong part of their identity for the rest of their lives afterwards, is because there was such a dissonance, right, between their attitudes and behaviors that they changed their attitude to match their behavior to become incredibly loyal. So I'm really incredibly pleased that this cognitive dissonance theory works in the US military, right, to make sure that we have incredibly fiercely loyal and motivated soldiers that aren't just going to turn and run at the first sign of adversity. To use another example of the dark side of cognitive dissonance theory, I was teaching the same lecture at the University of Florida, and I just had a couple examples, and this hand shot up in the back. And it was this female student who was a member of a sorority, and she shared what hazing was like in her sorority. And she said that in her sorority, they would get all the new recruits. And at night, after everyone else had left, it was just the new recruits and the members of that sorority. They would go downstairs into the basement where they had all their washers and dryers. And what they forced the new recruits to do is take off all their clothes except for their bras and their underwear. And they would have them sit on top of the washers and dryers. And they would start them. So the washers and dryers are running and the people sitting on top of the washer and dryer just in their underwear and and bra would start shaking back and forth. And every member of the sorority would take out a Sharpie and walk by and circle all the parts of their body that jiggled. And it was humiliating, right? You're probably getting kind of triggered just hearing this. Like, why in the world would anybody let themselves be demeaned in that way, right? Why would they let themselves be hazed in such a way that people are circling all the parts of fat on their body that are jiggling while they sit on top of this washer and dryer? And the person was like, no, 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 but like, you don't get it. The member of the sorority was saying, but yeah, I know it sounds rough, but like, this is a great sorority and it's so elite and prestigious and we do really great things. It's such like a privilege to be a part of this. That is cognitive dissonance theory. Your attitude is like, I'm a good person, right? And my behavior is I'm sitting here letting people circle the parts of my body that are jiggling, and it's humiliating. That should create dissonance, right? It feels uncomfortable of like, why am I doing this? And some people change their behavior and say, I'm out of here. I'm quitting this sorority. No thanks. But the folks who don't say, you know what? Like, let me change my attitude. Say, well, this was really worth it. This sorority is so great. And they change their attitudes to be consistent with their behavior. So there's a lot of different ways, the sort of like, but how do people deal with cognitive dissonance theory? They can change their attitude. They can change their behavior. They can ignore the inconsistency. But the most common way of dealing with cognitive dissonance is to change your attitudes, because it's private. No one can see you change your attitudes. You don't have to publicly change your behavior in a way that people are going to question you and think that you're a flip-flopper. You can privately change your attitude. In fact, that's what happened with the US military, that happens with people who stay in domestic violence situations, that happened with the sorority hazing, and that's what happened in the Leon Festinger study, where people changed their mind and said, yeah, this study really is exciting. I really did enjoy it when I get paid $1, an insufficient justification. And I'm sure you've experienced this too, right? When you start talking to people that smoke, you're like, hey, like, you're a good person, a worthwhile person. You know that smoking is bad for you, right? You know that smoking causes cancer, shortens your life expectancy, it smells, like all these things. Like, you know, this is your attitude that smoking is bad. But some people keep smoking, right? Smokers know this. They know that smoking is going to kill them. So what do? They either quit smoking. They're like, yep, you're right. Let me change my behavior. But not always, right? There's some people that will say, well, like, yeah, those studies are just correlational. Or, you know what, like, my grandma smoked 5 packs a day and she lived till she was 99 years old. Notice how they're changing their attitudes to be kind of dismissive so it lines up with their behavior. And some people will just ignore that information, ignore that sort of dissonance. But the takeaway is that when people have when people experience cognitive dissonance, there's a variety of ways they can handle it. The most common way that they deal with it is by changing their attitude. And they're most likely to experience cognitive dissonance when there's insufficient justification, right? When they chose to engage in that behavior and they aren't getting paid enough. There's no, you know, yes, you hate your job, but you keep showing up day after day. That should create dissonance, but then you realize, oh, if I don't, then I get fired and I don't get a paycheck, right? That paycheck is sufficient justification. But what if they stop paying you, right? That's when you should experience the most cognitive dissonance of, why am I doing this? So along this line, social psychologists have so much to say about attitudes and behavior. And one of the many ways that social psychologists in particular get hired on is by measuring people's attitudes, by measuring changes in their behavior. And they get hired in business as industrial organizational psychologists, and they get hired in marketing as market research analysts all the time, because they know how to change people's attitudes. They know how to persuade people by getting them to say yes when they would otherwise say no. So what I want to do, excuse me, what I want to do next is share with you some of the theories of persuasion that have garnered the most research attention, that are the most kind of tried and true ways of getting people to change their behavior or saying yes when they would otherwise say no. So anyway, if you want to teach your kid how to sell a bunch of Girl Scout cookies, or if you don't want to lose a bunch of money on the next car that you buy, Pay attention. You see persuasion in a lot of different contexts. Obviously, you see it in sales. I'll point out a lot of the tactics that those used car salesmen stereotypically use, and I'll share like some of the reasons why that sort of persuasion technique works on so many people. So that way, if you can identify this persuasion technique in someone else, you're going to be much less likely to be persuaded yourself. Or if you are a salesman, right, or you have to get other people to say yes when they would otherwise say no, these tactics can be worthwhile for you as well. You see persuasion, oh my gosh, you see persuasion on the home shopping network. The home shopping network is like the persuasion literature in social psychology on steroids. It's every tactic of, hey, while supplies last, oh my gosh, there's a shortage. Wait, who's calling me on the phone right now? Oh my gosh, I just got an order for 500, we're running out. Like using scarcity as a way to get you to persuade. They're lying. No one's calling on their phone right now. They don't know, like on that ticker, how many people are buying that product in real live time in a way that makes it seem like this is really valuable. But they know, like, hey, if I set up this timer where it seems like time is running out, and I put up this information of so many other people are doing this exact same thing too. And you know what? This product used to be $500, but for you, if it was one-time sale, act now, in the next 1 minute, I'll give it to you for $100. All that sort of time pressure, that contrast of dropping the price, that social validation of other people making the same purchase, all that stuff is research. It's all effective. Social psychologists have so much to say about it. And the home shopping network just like goes off the deep end using all these tactics. You also see the same sort of persuasion in politics, right? Getting people to change their beliefs. If you go right at someone and say, hey, I think you're wrong, it's going to be threatening for a lot of people. So what are some of the more nuanced ways that you can get people to change their attitudes, to change their behavior when they would otherwise do something different? So you certainly see persuasion in politics. Also, like as Christians, we don't use the term persuasion very much. But a lot of people would rather sleep in on Sunday morning. How can you get them to say yes and go to church when they would otherwise say no? Right? So the same sort of tactics work. And the most heavily researched theory within all of the persuasion literature is the elaboration likelihood model, the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model. And what it's all about is how likely are you to elaborate on a message, on a commercial, on a billboard, on some sort of advertisement that pops up on your Instagram feed. Right? How likely are you to elaborate on this information? And according to the elaboration likelihood model, there are two different routes of persuasion. You can persuade people by this peripheral route, which is very quick, like very quick processing where people rely on superficial cues. That peripheral route is when people aren't really paying that much attention and they're relying on all sort of heuristics like, oh yeah, like that person's wearing a lab coat, they must know what they're talking about. What you find is when people are processing information via the peripheral route, it can be persuasive, but it's typically small fries. It's typically for like low dollar purchases of like a $5 burger or a $2 tube of toothpaste or something like that, or like a type of gum or something like that. Like it's typically temporary attitude change or really small purchases. And there's all sorts of superficial cues that we'll talk about, like attractive people. Attractive people are more persuasive than unattractive people. So that's why when you're watching TV, you have attractive model after model endorsing this product. You have people saying, well, I'm a dentist and 4 out of 5 dentists agree. Like, that sounds like a lot, right? Notice how quick that information is, and it's all relying on these superficial cues of, hey, that person looks like me, or hey, that person's attractive, or hey, that person's talking really fast. They must know what they're talking about. All of that is geared for like temporary attitude change. The other route that's also effective is the central route. And the central route is when people are highly motivated to process that message. So they're definitely going to spend a long time. They're really likely to elaborate on that message. This type of persuasion can last a lifetime. It can change people's attitudes until the day that they die. The central route of persuasion is the route that you would want to take if you wanted to get people to drop $20,000 on a new car rather than $2 on a tub of hair gel or something like that, right? So when people are highly motivated to process this message, a nice example of this would be like when you were deciding whether to come to APU or not, right? You walk in and they're trying to persuade you to say, yes, come to APU, when you would otherwise say, well, no, I'm not really sure if I should go here or somewhere else. What you might find is the person working at the front desk says, hey, like, come here. They're really happy and smiley and attractive. And they're saying, there are 5 reasons why you should come to APU. We have a library, we have faculty, we have trees around campus, we have other students, and we have a pool for our swim team. And you think to yourself, right? It's like, hey, that person like seems really positive. They rattled off 5 main reasons I should go here really quickly. And 5 is a lot of reasons, right? But what if you're a senior and you're like, no. Like, this is like my decision for the next 4 years of my life. And wait, how expensive, is college, right? It is expensive. It's the next 4 years of my life. Let me pause you on those 5 things. You rattled off 5 things really quickly, but I think the first thing you said was, this place has a library. Every university should have a library. And didn't you say that you had faculty and other students? Like, shouldn't every university have those? Notice when like you're the student, you are not just saying, wow, 5 was a lot via this peripheral route, because you are motivated, because this decision is relevant to you. That's when you're really likely to process this message via the central route, more likely to elaborate on it. The same way when you're like, some, macho guy buying a truck or something like that, right? You have the commercial where it's like, yeah, like, Ford tough, and you have this really gruff looking guy like walk out to his truck, and then they dump all these rocks in the back, and you drive through a work site, and you're like, yeah, like real men drive this truck. And by the end of the commercial, you're like, oh, that looks cool. Yeah, that does look like a manly truck. Yeah, cool. And you kind of, like temporarily, you think that truck might be really cool. But what happens if you are the type of person that like is in the market for a truck? Notice at the very end of that commercial where they have all that little text of like all the interest rates, of all the special deals, how the MSRP, the manufacturer suggested retail price, compares to others. Like, they have all that information. Notice when you're in the market for a truck, you hit the pause button and you're reading all of that text. You're like, I don't care if you spent a lot of money and got some really like famous looking macho guy to sit in that truck. I don't care. How much is it? What's the miles per gallon? Like, notice when you're motivated to process this message because it's relevant to you. Now you want to process it via the central route. But for most people who aren't buying a new truck, for instance, they're going to be more persuaded by those superficial cues of, hey, it looks cool, and there was cool music playing in the background. There was a macho guy driving it, things like that. So anyway, that was too much of me talking about the elaboration likelihood model. Let me show you some pictures. Let me show you some examples of advertisements that you might see in the real world, and let's play the game, peripheral route or central route. What about something like this? The message is clear, right? There's almost no text in this whatsoever. There's no statistics, there's no numbers, there's no information to really elaborate on. Instead, it's relying on a real superficial cue of like, oh my gosh, if you text and drive, you might die. That's the peripheral route, relying on those superficial cues of your motion, of the kind of imagery, not the central route, which would have hit you with all those numbers and so on. This is an advertisement using the central route. And its message is exactly the same, right? Of don't text and drive. But now notice it's like information overload, right? So much information, all these percentages about how your reaction time changes and what percentage of kids, of teenagers speed and things like that. Like both of these advertisements have the exact same message, right? Don't text and drive. Most people run on autopilot, meaning we're like scrolling through our Instagram feeds real quick. We aren't thinking unless we absolutely have to. We're cognitive misers in that way. So what you see in the world around us are a lot of advertisements geared towards the peripheral route like this. But some people that are like teen drivers that just got their driver's license, they might pause on this picture in their Instagram feed and really dive into all of the stats, right? Because they're motivated to process it really deeply because it's relevant to them. Here are a couple more advertisements using the peripheral route, and the message is clear. Don't smoke. Might lead to impotence, might shorten your life. And these are all peripheral route, superficial cues. There's no stats here. There's no data to back it up. There's no percentages or a lot of text. In fact, the text is just really minimal, right? They aren't even talking about the correlational studies or the randomized control trials or anything like that. But they're just trying to get this idea of like smoking is going to kill you and lead to impotence. Peripheral route. Check out these advertisements. Walls of text to buy this computer. If you aren't in the market for this computer, if you don't have very much money, if you don't care about computers, if you don't need a computer in the near future, you're going to see this advertisement in you're going to see this advertisement in the magazine and say next and go to the next page, right? It's only for the people that are in the market that are going to be motivated to process this message that are going to read through all this information and be persuaded. Those folks are going to take it through the central route. The same thing over here, this oldie but goodie for was this antifreeze, Prestone antifreeze. They have a calendar down here at the bottom where they compare how often you'd have to use their antifreeze versus their competitors. Most people aren't going to do the math. Most people aren't going to be like, oh, great, a table, let me dive into that. But some people are, if they're interested in antifreeze. If their car isn't running well and they hear their car mechanic say, hey, you need to worry about antifreeze. Now that's relevant to them, notice how they'll dive into this message. The same sort of superficial cues that are used in peripheral advertisements. You see them on TVs like this, of Colonial Penn life insurance or things like that. Who is this? This is Alex Trebek, right? Someone who looks like an expert, right? This person answers the questions on Jeopardy, right? Asks the questions and tells the contestants what the answers are when they get the answer wrong. So people think that Alex Trebek is really, really smart. So if he, right, this person who's really smart is telling me that Colonial Penn is the best company out there for your life insurance, you better believe it. Right? That's those superficial cues. He's being paid to do this advertisement. He's not an expert on life insurance. He's a game show host. There's a reason why you'll pay people millions of dollars to endorse your product. Here's a beer advertisement for Dos Equis, right? And you have the most interesting man in the world. Notice what's great about this is it's a fictional character. So they can make this fictional character as cool as they possibly want, and the person's never gonna get arrested or anything bad kind of happen to him. So they can constantly associate this really cool, most interesting man in the world with their product. And when you're walking through the beer aisle and there's, hey man, there's like 100 different beers here. Sure, who cares? You know, Corona versus Dos Equis. Yeah, let's go Dos Equis. Those low stakes, temporary attitude change. If you see this billboard on the way in, it's going to change your behavior to buy Dos Equis rather than Corona or the Pacifico or something like that. Here's another oldie but goodie. Viceroys, filter the smoke. As your dentist, I would recommend Viceroys. And in hindsight, we're like, this is a rough advertisement. But for people, when smoking was new and when people were thinking about, well, is it bad for me? The research hasn't really proven conclusively one way or the other. This arose, hey, if this dentist, right, someone who should know something about tongue cancer and oral throat cancer and things like that, if he says this does a better job at filtering the smoke, then maybe I should go with it. What's more likely today is we'd see things like this. As someone standing in a white lab coat, I recommend this. Or 4 out of 5 dentists agree, use Crest or something like that. Where if you see that commercial, yeah, great, 4 out of 5 dentists, that's a lot. And then when you're walking through the aisle at your grocery store and you're like, yeah, who cares? It's $1 for some toothpaste, Crest, that's fine. Low stakes, temporary attitude change. This peripheral advertisement is going to be effective. Well, what if, let's say you had like a history of gingivitis or something like that, and your breath like always stinks, and like you had all these cavities all the time, and like you're really focused and motivated to make sure that you're buying really good toothpaste. When this commercial comes on, you're like, wait, who are these dentists? Are they being paid to be a part of the survey? Who of the 4 out of 5 dentists, what schools did they go to? Like, are they reputable dentists? Are they being paid to participate in the study? Notice how likely you are to elaborate on this message. You aren't going to be persuaded by these superficial cues if you're processing it via the central route. But most people are cognitive misers and don't think unless they have to. And that's why you see people with white lab coats standing confidently. It's the same reason why you have Activia and Papa John's and all these other commercials paying millions of dollars to celebrities, because they're using the same sort of like kind of classically conditioned response of, oh yeah, I've seen her before. I've seen her in movies. I like her. Or yeah, I'm a Colts fan. I remember Peyton Manning, who's this really nice guy. He threw all these touchdowns. Yeah, I like that guy. I've been cheering for him Sunday after Sunday, year after year. And then when you have this person that you like automatically, what we might call in classically conditioned language, like a Pavlov dog, someone like an unconditioned stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response, right? This is your favorite celebrity. You see them, it makes you feel good. What happens when they're always holding up Activia? Or they're saying, I like Papa John's pizza, or I buy Rolex watches, or something like that. Activia, Papa John's, and Rolex watches, those are neutral stimulus. Like, I don't like it, I don't dislike it, I don't really know a whole lot about Activia. I've never tried it before. It's a neutral stimulus. So what happens when you pair them with someone that you like over and over and over again? You air this commercial over and over and over again, every single commercial break for the entire show that you're watching. And by the end of it, you've made this association, right? You're Pavlov's dogs. You've seen those associations over and over and over again. What happens the next night when it's like, hey, does pizza sound good? Sure, let me pull up, and you type in pizza near me, and it hits Papa John's, Domino's, DiGiorno, things like that. And you're like, yeah, let's go with Papa John's. It sounds good, or it feels like a good choice. Like, yeah, that sounds right. That sort of feeling of, yeah, I feel good about that one, is just carryover for how you felt about Peyton Manning, or how you felt about, what's his name, Jamie Lee Curtis from from the Activia commercial. That positive feeling that gets carried over towards the product is classical conditioning. And it's all these superficial cues. It's the same reason why you have the law offices of Hoopy and Abram having William Shatner endorse their product. It's like Captain Kirk, right, is endorsing like Priceline, and the law offices of Hoopy and Abram, like, what does he know about hotels? What does he know about the best deals out there? What does he know about law and who can get you off, for all these things? Nothing, right? He's an actor. Well, what happens, it's like, hey, I've seen this person so often. I've seen all of his shows. He's always playing the good guy, the character that I like, that I've been rooting for. I've seen him so often, I can process his face easily. So I like him. When he endorses a product that's neutral, you tend to like that product as well. So then later on, when you do find yourself in need of law offices and you hit Google real quick and Hoopy and Abraham pop up, you're like, yeah, I feel good about this one. This one sounds familiar. which is persuasion at its best. Another instance of persuasion that you've probably seen over and over and over again is Geico, right? They air these commercials, and they aren't even like commercials that are saying like anything beyond you can save 15% in 15 minutes. Is that right? In 15 minutes, you can save 15% or more on your car insurance. Notice that they say that again repeatedly and repeatedly as a superficial cue of like repetition and processing as a jingle. But anyway, aside from that superficial cue, what Geico is really good at is just airing jokes, right? You see this, and it's like a funny, cute little gecko out there, who's like mad because he had to make too many copies at the copy machine, or he's overacting on the side of the road because his car got a flat tire, and he's like, "Why do I have to have a flat tire?" And you see this, you're like, "Oh, that's funny. It's a gecko with a flat tire. That's funny," right? And you laugh at this 30-second joke, and then at the very end, Geico, right? A big, clear label right across the screen. So what's wonderful about Geico is what happens if you tell someone the same joke over and over and over again. It's not funny anymore. In fact, if you keep telling someone the same joke over and over and over again, you're like, this is actually starting to piss me off. Like, I get it. Like, I know where this is going. It's not funny anymore. And what Geico wants to do is they want to use your emotion, right? Making you feel good the way you're laughing at this joke. They want you to associate that with their product, Geico. That's why they air, like after this really funny punchline, the very next scene is always Geico really big across the screen. And when you tell someone different jokes, right, about hump day and when pigs fly and so easy a caveman can do it and Dikembe Mutombo, no, like all these things, we start airing these funny jokes over and over again, they're constantly being associated with this product, Geico. So later on, when you hit Google, you're like, hey, that's right, I need car insurance. Allstate, Geico, Wawanisa, what should I be using? That Geico might just feel right to you. You might have a good feeling about it. That's why they're shelling out millions and millions of dollars on these commercials that are literally just jokes. Using your emotion is a characteristic of the peripheral route to persuasion. Some of those emotions that are listed by advertisements are really negative, right? They make you feel really sad or really angry, like this one, right? Mothers Against Drunk Driving or Save a Life. On this one, it says, not everyone who gets hit by a drunk driver dies. And they air like this really graphic and sad picture of someone's face and life has been drastically changed by a drunk driver. Because they want to make you feel really, really negative and really angry and sad about this. It's the same reason why you would see advertisements like this, like want to chill later, and it's someone's cell phone going off when their body's in a morgue. You're like, man, that's a real Debbie Downer. Why am I thinking the fact that I might die if I text and drive and my body will be in a morgue, I'll never be able to text my friends again? Why make people feel that way about your product or about your company or about your advertisement? You see the same thing with don't smoking. You have pictures like Terry, who passed away a few years ago, about what would happen if you smoke and your tracheotomy and how you'd have to shower differently and how your voice would sound differently if you have throat or esophageal cancer or something like that. You can literally hear the Sarah McLachlan music in the background from the ASPCA, that really sad song about looking at these puppy dogs and they're starving to death, and you can see all the bones in their rib cage, and they look so incredibly sad. And there's some of you right now just looking at this kind of wincing, being like, why are we sticking on this page so long? Why would the ASPCA you like try and garner up all these negative emotions in you? It's because it's effective. It's the same way that these advertisements by kind of feeding the hungry are effective. They show you really poor, malnourished, starving kids across the globe. You can see all the ribs on their side and their bloated stomachs, and they're starving for food. All of these commercials that activate these negative feelings they all end the exact same way. For 25 cents a day, you can save this child's life by going to your local animal shelter and saving a dog, or by donating to the ASPCA today. You can save a dog's life. Right? Notice how all of these negative advertisements that are designed to make you feel really bad, they all end with some sort of call to action that's going to make you feel better, right? That's negative reinforcement at its best. Say, hey, you feel really bad right now? I can alleviate that negative feeling that you guys are experiencing if you do something. If you donate money, if you save this dog, if you support our cause, if you stop texting and driving, you name it. And what happens is people are like, yeah, I'm gonna do that. Here's 25 cents. Here's another donation. Here's my change of behavior. I'm not gonna do this anymore. Makes people feel better again. And these commercials always end on a really positive note. That's why after you donate money or something like that, they send you those sort of thank you postcards you put on your fridge. So afterwards, you're walking by and like, oh yeah, that's right. My 25 cents saved this child's life. Or yeah, this is a puppy dog that's now playing catch with its new owner because I donated some money. So not only were they using negative reinforcement in the moment to get you to donate, but they're using positive reinforcement every single time you walk by your refrigerator, making you feel good based on your donation behavior. I'm telling you, psychology has so much to do with marketing and research and getting people to say yes when they would otherwise say no. And it can be put in the right hands to get people to stop texting and driving and drinking and driving and to save lives, to get tested for the coronavirus and things like that. But unfortunately, the same tips and tricks for persuasion can also be used aggressively and predatorily to get people to use reverse mortgages on their homes and to pay more money for cars than they actually should. So anyway, if you have any other questions about persuasion, feel free to reach out to me. Again, if you're interested in any of these sub-disciplines of psychology, like developmental psychology or brain behavior or social psychology or personality, there are whole classes, whole 16-week-long courses devoted to each of these. Anyway, just a plug. The next thing I want to talk about is another really, unfortunately, timely and important topic within social psychology, and that's stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And people use these terms interchangeably, but they're really different. Stereotyping or stereotypes are attitudes or beliefs. Right? So you can have positive stereotypes, like Asians are good at math, or negative stereotypes, like Asians are bad drivers, for instance. So notice here that you have the same social identity, in this case Asians, having both positive and negative stereotypes associated with them. The same way you might have positive and negative stereotypes about elderly people, right? They're really forgetful, and their memories might be a negative stereotype, but they're really warm and wise and caring. You know, it might be a positive stereotype that people might have. Unfortunately, a lot of the stereotypes that people have when they overgeneralize tend to be negative. So these stereotypes are characteristics that you make about an individual person based on his or her group membership. And people unfortunately use this all the time because, as I mentioned earlier, people are lazy. They are cognitive misers. They don't think unless they absolutely have to. We run on autopilot. We automatically process things as fastly as we can. We use heuristics, right? We use the representativeness heuristic, where it's like, oh, you're attractive, you must be helpful. And sometimes we get fooled, right? We ask really attractive people for directions and they don't know where they're going, right? So sometimes these stereotypes can be wrong. In this case, it's a positive stereotype about attractive people. But we might have other stereotypes that aren't kernels of truth that might even be factually wrong. And what you have is people making really bad decisions where they're judging people by the color of their skin rather than the kind of content of their character, right? They're inferring characteristics about an individual person based on the generalizations that they're making about his or her group membership. So I mentioned earlier that stereotypes get confused with prejudice and discrimination. Stereotypes are attitudes, these kind of beliefs about, hey, I think you're going to be like this based on your group membership. Prejudice is disliking, kind of devaluing someone because of his or her group membership. Whereas discrimination is behavior, where you start treating someone differently because of his or her group membership, not hiring them for a job, sitting further away from them, not shaking their hand or shaking their hand for a smaller amount of time, not letting them move into certain neighborhoods. Like those are instances of institutional major discrimination that's unfortunately occurred in America and the rest of the globe for a really long time, and unfortunately still continues today to a large extent. There are some psychologists that have argued that prejudice has kind of gone down over time, that people are being less prejudiced in their disliking of other groups. But what you're finding when you start asking people their implicit attitudes or their like kind of gut feeling, their quick associations of groups and whether they like them or dislike them, people are just lying. They're explicit attitudes. They're telling you that, oh yeah, I'm egalitarian. I treat everyone equally. I'm not racist. But when you start looking at their gut feelings and their quick associations, people still express prejudice. And it's just turning out different. It's less of this kind of like old-fashioned racism where people are saying this group is superior or inferior to someone else. And instead, what it's shifting into is more of like a modern racism, where people aren't saying that, hey, like this group is better than that group, but they're saying things like, well, like this issue that tends to really help this group, that's really important to me, or that issue that really hurts that other group, yeah, that's something that we should vote for too. So what you see is people's attitudes are less kind of in your face as they used to be. You see this person dumping water on folks in a sit-in, protesting against integration rather than segregation. You tend not to see this sort of like blatant in-your-face prejudice as much. It's decreased over time, but implicit prejudice, that automatic association that people have, is still unfortunately there. Recently, you've seen a lot of personality traits that are associated with prejudice, like authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, believing that there should be inequality kind of built in, that some groups are inherently better or worse than others. You see people like the alt-right scoring off the charts in explicit and implicit measures of prejudice. So I could spend an entire course just talking about all the different theories of why people are prejudiced. Unfortunately, today in this chapter, I'll just touch on a few of some of the bigger ones out there that do a nice job of explaining why. Why are people prejudiced? Can we change it? Yes. How do we go about changing it? So anyway, that's stereotypes, your attitudes, beliefs. Prejudice, disliking someone because of their group membership, and discrimination is treating someone differently because of their group membership. So why does prejudice exist? The first theory I want to talk about is realistic conflict theory. Realistic conflict theory argues that when you have two groups competing for a limited or scarce resource, prejudice is going to be the result. So what you tend to find is some folks in America that are tend to be lower kind of SES, lower socioeconomic status, meaning they aren't making as much money, they don't have the same sort of access to education as other groups, and they tend to be competing for some of the lower paying jobs out there. Those folks, right, tend to express the most prejudice towards people that they perceive as like like crossing the border illegally and things like, you know, taking our jobs and things like that. Really kind of valenced and prejudicial language. But what they're seeing is like this kind of fixed pie scenario. What they're unfortunately misperceiving is that there are so many jobs to go around, and if the other group takes more jobs, then that means that there's less jobs for us. So if there is a realistic conflict for scarce or limited resource, prejudice or disliking the other group is going to be the result. You see the same things between like Republicans and Democrats, right? There are only so many Senate seats. There are only so many seats in the House of Representatives. And when they see as one group winning elections, that's seen as a loss for their, for their rival side. Instead of realizing that, hey, there's a lot of compromise that can be brought together and win-win scenarios. The folks that don't see that, they see it as like a win or lose situation. If the other group is winning, that means that we're losing. That's when realistic conflict theory would argue that you would see a lot of prejudice. The same thing happens in the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Right? They both believe that, hey, this piece of land is our holy land. And if another group, if Israel gets more, then Palestine gets less, and vice versa. And what you see is hatred, right? Prejudice towards the other group, because they're seeing it as a fixed pie. If one group gets more, the other group gets less. So this realistic conflict theory has been shown time and time again with different groups that are seen to be competing over a limited resource. And the first study that really targeted it in a field context was the Robbers Cave experiment. Musfir Sharif was a social psychologist at the University of Oklahoma, and just outside of the university, there's Robbers Cave National Park. And over the summer, what Musfir Sharif and his research team did is they took local kids, right, from the local elementary school, and they said, hey, we'll send you to this summer camp at Robbers Cave National Park. And they, brought the kids, they put them on buses, and then they dropped them off in part of the camp and said, hey, you guys kind of do your own thing. We'll be here on the outskirts, making sure that no one gets hurt or anything like that. But the real part of this camp was like, you guys kind of do your own thing. What Musfir Sharif didn't tell these kids is that they weren't the only group there. There were actually 2 buses, and they were dropped off on either side of Robbers Cave National Park. And what they quickly realized is, hey, we aren't the only ones here. So as soon as the 2 groups of kids realized that they weren't the only group there, the first thing that they did is they named themselves. What is your group name and what is my group name? Notice that they didn't care about that sort of group identity until they realized that they weren't the only group out there. And now they needed some way to kind of disentangle, which group are you, which group am I? After the kids realized that there are 2 different groups out there, and Musfir Sharif stepped in and said, yep, sorry, completely forgot to tell you guys that. There are 2 groups of kids out there, and what we're going to be doing is a lot of competition. We're going to be playing a bunch of games like kickball and tug of war and scavenger hunts and all sorts of different competition games out there. And if your group wins, you get money to spend at the local gas station where they can buy malts, which are like ice cream smoothies and things like that, and candy and gum and snacks and things like that. So if your group wins, you get money and the other group doesn't. And they said, and if your group wins tug of war, if your group wins the kickball tournament, then you get to eat first, and you get to eat as much as you want, and the other group that lost has to go second. So notice that they really quickly kind of set it up where they're playing these games against each other, and it's not win-win. It's not for love of the sport. They're playing games where it's one group wins and the other group loses. And then Musfir Sharif just watched what happened. And the first day it was fine, right? Here's a picture of Robbers Cave today. Here's a picture of some of those elementary school kids at Robbers Cave during the time of the social psychology field study. And what they found is During these games, the teams labeled themselves as the Eagles and the Rattlers. So they kept playing all these games time and time again. And what they found is that the Rattlers kept losing and the Eagles kept winning. So the Eagles won at kickball, they got money to spend at the local store. They won at tug of war, they got to eat first. They kept winning, getting all these perks. You have a sign that one of the kids made saying, Eagles, you may win, but we'll give you a hell of a fight. And that's their motto, they've been saying. So you have them competing over and over and over again. And the first day it was fine, one group kept winning, and then the next day it got really dark. During the game, they started cussing at one another, or they started yelling insults at the Eagles, who kept losing, kept yelling insults at the Rattlers. The Rattlers got to eat first. So what the Eagles did is while the Rattlers were eating, they went over to their camp, all their tents, and they crushed it with rocks. They took all these rocks and they threw it on their camps, breaking everything. So then, after they were done doing that, the Rattlers come back out, see that their camp has been destroyed. The Eagles go to eat, and the Rattlers go and they start setting fire to the Eagles' camp. Now they're breaking out in fistfights, they're starting fires, they're throwing rocks at each other, they're cursing. It's like, this was only after a couple days. How easy it is to create conditions where prejudice can rise. Unfortunately, all you needed to do is create a realistic conflict between the two groups. Musa Sharif thought that these conditions to create prejudice would take a little bit longer, right? It would be a couple week-long summer camp, only a couple days before they were literally throwing rocks at each other, hurling insults, and trying to burn each other's camps down. So at this point, Musa Sharif is saying, nope, let me intervene, let me stop this. It was all too easy to create prejudice. How can I stop it from lingering, or how can I actually reverse it and get these groups to start liking each other? So what Musa Sharif decided to do is create cooperation. Previously, they'd been in competition, right? One group's win was seen as the other group's failure. What Musa Sharif did is wanted to get the groups to start cooperating with each other. In the middle of that night, he took this towel and wedged it up into the big water reservoir. So the water reservoir was this big kind of jug of water where all the kids would kind of get their water from. And when the Eagles woke up that morning, their water didn't work, and they ran over to the Rattlers to blame them. And the Rattlers said, nope, we didn't do it. They blamed the Eagles. And then they realized that they had a shared problem. That they didn't do it to each other, but both of them needed water to survive. And they needed to solve this problem together. And they went up, they found the water reservoir, they saw the towel that was shoved in there, and no kid by themselves was strong enough to rip it out by themselves, but instead they had to literally work together to kind of pull it inch by inch, piece by piece, cooperatively to solve this problem. And after that sort of cooperative activity, what they started doing is started changing some of the nature of the games that they were playing, where they had to cooperate to solve problems together, like a scavenger hunt or an escape room or things like that, where it wasn't one group wins, the other group loses. It was, we have to rely on each other. We have to support each other so both of us can win or both of us lose. And what they found is by a few days of engaging in cooperation, the Eagles and Rattlers didn't want to be part of separate camps anymore. They wanted to integrate. They wanted to just be one big camp. They didn't want to have one group eat first, the other group eat second. They wanted to all eat in the same big mess hall at the exact same time. They started becoming friends. They started liking each other. And on the way back, after camp was over, they didn't want to ride home in the same school buses that drove them up there, where they were segregated. They wanted to integrate and kind of sit with their friends from both groups from the beginning. And in a really nice final send-off on the way home, how the Rattlers had just won up so much money by beating the Eagles so badly in all those early games. They all stopped at the local gas station and got malts for everybody, which is a really nice way of showing that you can reduce prejudice and even create this intergroup trust and cooperation by getting them to work together. Here's more pictures of that kind of water reservoir and the kids having to work together to dislodge the towel stuck in there. And here's more pictures of them. So kind of nice, right? It certainly doesn't create um, a plan to solve the crisis, the conflict in the Middle East, but it does suggest the conditions where prejudice is going to be greater and when it's going to be lessened. And if you can get people to stop thinking of this fixed pie, I win, you lose, or if your group wins, I lose. If you can get them to realize that, hey, we have a shared problem here. How can we work together so we both win? That would theoretically decrease prejudice. The next theory I want to talk about is social identity theory. Social identity theory argues that whenever you have two groups, people are going to identify with one group, right? The group that they belong to is called the in group, and the group that they don't belong to, the other, is referred to as the out group. And according to social identity theory, people maintain a positive and distinct identity by belonging to certain groups. It's the same way you see a lot of like bandwagon Laker fans right now, right? That jump on like, oh yeah, I'm always a Laker fan. They're wearing a bunch of Laker stuff, saying this is my in group because the group is doing really well. They want to associate with it, and they think the group is more positive and more distinct and so different than Clippers fans or Kings fans or anything like that. Social identity theory argues that as soon as you have an us and a them, as soon as you put people in a situation, they realize that there's two groups, they'll identify with one group, and the group that they identify with, right, their in group, they will automatically think is better. It's called in group favoritism. And you can do this by flipping a coin and taking random people and flipping a coin saying, oh, it's heads, you're in the heads group. Flip another coin, oh, next kid, you're tails, you're in the second group. What you can do is randomly shuffle groups like this and then ask people in the heads group to say, hey, rate how kind and moral and funny and likable and good people in your group are, and rate how fine and kind and moral and good people in the out group are. And what you find is that people in the heads group think that their group is better, and people in the tails group think that their group is better, which is impossible, right? The groups were randomly assigned by flipping a coin. But what you find is people think that the group that they belong to is better than other groups. And you see the same thing with college majors, right? You have certain college students like, oh, like being a psychology major is so great, or being a nursing major is so great. And it's just because that's the group that they belong to. They think it's better than the other groups out there. That's what social identity theory argues, is as soon as you have people identifying in groups, that's the only thing that you need for prejudice to arise. People will express in-group favoritism, thinking that their group is better than other groups, and they can also engage in out-group derogation, thinking other groups aren't as good as their own. They've tested this, unfortunately, in a lot of really creative situations, like flipping coins, heads and tails, by asking people preferences, right? Do you like this major versus that major? Do you go to Citrus College? Do you go to APU? Right? We see the same sort of bias where APU students think APU is better. Citrus College thinks Citrus Owls are better. Um, um, the same thing happened in Riceville, Iowa, where these third graders were. These kids in third grade in Riceville, Iowa, down here, in the late 1960s, I believe, they went up to their third grade teacher, a woman named Jane Elliott, and they said, hey, I was watching the news last night and they said some king was assassinated. And it was at that moment that Jane Elliott, their teacher, realized that it wasn't just some king, it was Martin Luther King Jr. that was assassinated. And what she realized is in Riceville, Iowa, which is almost entirely white, not a diverse place whatsoever, that the kids in her third grade classroom would never know like what it felt to be prejudiced against and experience discrimination. So what Jane Elliott did is created a little microcosm of prejudice in her classroom, just so her students could get that sort of perspective, just so they could feel what it's like to walk a mile in someone else's shoes who is being uh, prejudiced and discriminated against. So what Jane Elliott did was this blue eyes, brown eyes study. What she did is she walked into her class the next day and said, hey, like, I hate to tell this to you, but blue-eyed kids are better than brown-eyed kids. And she kind of set it up as like, hey, you have blue eyes, you did really well on your math test. Yep. You over there, you have brown eyes, and didn't you say you forgot your lunch this morning? And like quickly got the kids in her classroom to believe that the blue-eyed kids were better than the brown-eyed kids. And then she watched them the rest of the day. And she watched them literally start treating each other differently, where the blue-eyed kids started going to recess quicker, started mistreating, getting more fights in recess with some of the brown-eyed kids. When they started doing learning activities in class that day, what they found is that the blue-eyed kids were doing better and the brown-eyed kids were doing worse, just because they thought that their group was either superior or inferior to one another. The day after that, Jane Elliott says, you know what? I'm sorry about that. Yesterday I said blue-eyed kids were better than brown-eyed kids. I completely misspoke. I was wrong. It's actually brown-eyed kids that are better than blue-eyed kids. She flipped the script. And what you saw is the exact same level of prejudice and discrimination just flip to the other way. You saw stereotype threat happen, where you had these kids trying to learn like their ABCs or trying to learn how to read. And when they were in the group that they thought was positively stereotyped, they read significantly better. They learned at a quicker rate than the group that was in this case kind of marginalized and said to be inferior. Those groups experienced stereotype threat where they actually suffered academically when they tried to learn that day. And then the third day, Jane Elliott brings them all together and explains the activity and says, hey, blue eyes are not any different than brown-eyed kids, but I want to create this because I'm afraid you won't realize what it's like for so many people of various ethnicities in America today to experience prejudice and discrimination. It's a really cool video. If you like, I can send you the link to it where you can watch the full study where they show kind of snippets. It's an incredibly powerful video. I show the whole thing in my social psychology class, but it's a really, really fantastic little microcosm of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So the first year that they did the study, it was incredibly moving and affected these students positively for the rest of their lives. She's been doing this every year after that, and the parents of these kids are trying to get themselves into her class just so they can get this experience. So that's kind of scary, right? According to social identity theory, the only thing that's necessary for prejudice to resolve it is groups. And unfortunately, people are all too good at finding ways of categorizing us and them. It might be on what school you go to, it might be based on your religion, it might be on your sexual orientation, it might be on, you name it, what kind of shoes you wear, or what side of the street you live on, or anything like that. People are remarkable at finding ways to categorize us versus them. And according to social identity theory, as soon as you have an us and a them, you'll have prejudice. That's all that it takes for in-group favoritism and out-group derogation to resolve. But according to social identity theory, one of the ways you can get rid of prejudice is by changing the groups, right? So on September 10th, 2001, the day before September 11th, you had social psychologists doing studies where they were measuring prejudice, and you saw people expressing anti-Black prejudice and prejudice towards gay people and prejudice towards all of these different groups. On September 11th, right, they kept running these studies not knowing that on September 11th, there was going to be this horrific terrorist attack in New York City and Washington, the Pentagon. And what you found is after September 11th, people stopped talking about themselves as, you know, are you white or Black? Are you gay or straight? What they started talking about themselves is, are you American? So notice how the group changed. On September 10th, you saw all sorts of anti-gay, anti-Black, other types of prejudice out there. Those all significantly reduced after September 11th. And because people were now saying, well, we're all the same. Us, doesn't matter, gay, straight, white, Black, we are American. So they got lumped into this us category that shared all the benefits of the in-group favoritism. The downside to that is who got put in the out group. If we're America, who is a terrorist? Who is an out group? And you saw people in New York stereotyping cab drivers from the Middle East, pulling them out pulling them out of their cabs, engaging in hate crimes of discrimination, were physically beating them up because they weren't stereotypically seen as American, even though they were American and they lived in America. They saw themselves as being this kind of other, this out group, where they started expressing prejudice and discriminating against. So one of my bad jokes is, according to social identity theory, the only way to truly get rid of prejudice in the world today is to be attacked by aliens from outer space. Because then we'll stop worrying about, well, are you American or Mexican, or are you gay or straight? Are you Republican or Democrat? We won't be categorizing that way anymore. Instead, what we'll be thinking about is, are you human or not? So our in-group will expand to every human being on the planet, at least until we win the battle against aliens and they leave. And then we would resort back to categorizing ourselves along different dimensions. So anyway, that's social identity theory for you. Self-categorization, in-groups, out-groups is all that you need for prejudice. Luckily, there are other ways to reduce prejudice. One of them is perspective taking, like the Jane Elliott study. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes significantly reduces prejudice, but also intergroup contact. Just interacting with people that are different than you. Different skin color, different sexual orientation, different, like whoever the outgroup is. As soon as you start interacting with people from the them or other or outgroup category, you start to have more favorable attitudes towards them. Prejudice goes down. And what happens, according to this kind of contact hypothesis, is you start realizing, hey, we have a whole lot more in common. You like the same foods that I do. We both love our mamas. We both like similar types of music. Or, you know what, like we both like playing the same sports and we like the same athletes. And similarity breeds liking. It is one of the biggest maxims in social psychology and of psychology as a whole. The more similar you are to someone, the more you like that person. So over time, you start interacting with people, you start realizing that, hey, you have a whole lot more in common with them than you do something that's different. It helps if this intergroup contact is positive and cooperative, kind of like in the Robbers Cave study. It helps if it's positive and cooperative, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, if you ever look back to some of the videos on integration of the schools, and like Brown v. Board of Education, you have Black students facing all sorts of prejudice and discrimination and stereotypes, walking into schools where people were throwing things at them, hurling insults. They literally had to be protected by the National Guard, and they were worried about the hate crimes and crosses being burned in their yards and the Klan and all sorts of prejudice that reared its head when you started creating intergroup contact. But over time, integration, right, this intergroup contact led to decreased prejudice. You start realizing, hey, some of the stereotypes that I had were wrong. People experience what's called outgroup homogeneity, which is just a really fancy word of saying they're all the same. The reason why you think they're all the same is because you don't know them. You know all the members of your own in-group, right? You know your family, you know all your friends who unfortunately tend to look like you and come from similar backgrounds as you and have similar values as you and are the same groups that you belong to, just by very nature of how social networks develop and form over time. You know, it's like, yeah, people's noses look different, people's skin color look different, their values look different, their food preferences are different. You see the wide range of variability in your own group, but when you look at the other out group, you think that they're all the same. And then as soon as you start interacting with them, you start realizing, hey, I can't just judge every person in that group by this one blanket stereotype that I have. They all aren't the same. They have the same level of variability as everyone in my in-group does. And that reduces prejudice. So it challenges this idea that everyone else is the same. So that was dark. Let's pick up the vibe a little bit. Another fun topic that I study as a social psychologist is prejudice as well as social relationships. So how people fall in love. So if you're single and want to know how to find a love that'll last the rest of your life, this is the part of the lecture to definitely start paying attention to. The folks who created Match.com were social psychologists. The folks that created eHarmony was a clinical psychologist that used the same sort of maxims and research from the chapter that I'll share with you next. You know, that like secret algorithm that Match and eHarmony use, it's not secret. It was created by social psychologists, and I'll share with you what that secret algorithm is that draws people together into forming relationships and long-lasting committed relationships. So, what makes you like someone to begin with? In the most unromantic, unsexy perspective on it, what people find to be attractive are average features and symmetrical features. That's it. If you click on this link right here, it's a really cool activity. What you can do is start averaging like two men's faces together. And although each person, like on a 1 to 10 scale, isn't a 10, when you start averaging two people's faces together, they get a little bit more attractive. When you average 5 men's faces together, they get more attractive. 100 men's faces together, it becomes really attractive. And the same thing happens for women as well, that the more average features are seen as attractive, meaning it's not someone that has like really big eyes or really small eyes. It's people that have average looking eyes, or not really big noses or small noses. It's average noses. It's not really tall ears or short ears. It's average looking features are seen as most attractive. And when you start averaging faces together, you also start creating symmetry. So in utero, when babies, basically these zygotes, the sperm and egg are kind of coming together, and that cell is splintering, is kind of dividing and dividing and dividing and becoming what we know to be a baby, right? It was the DNA is dividing and replicating in a way that the person should be a perfectly symmetrical mirror image of each other, right? Their right hand should be the same as their left hand. Their right arm should be the same as their right arm. Their right ear should be the same height as their left ear. Their right eye should be the same size as their left eye, and so on, right? That we should, if you were to kind of cut us right in half, right, or put us in front of a mirror, the right side of our face and body should be the same as our left side of our face and body. But that's not true, right? If you were to look in a mirror right now, or if you were to hit pause and go into the bathroom and look at just one side of your face and then look at the other, you realize that the right side of your face isn't a perfect mirror image of the left side of our faces. And that's because of teratogens and mutations and all sorts of things that happen of what mom is smoking and eating, and during utero, all sort of random mutations of why one of our ears is just a little bit different than the other, all sorts of like experiences in the early stages of our development change. So we aren't perfect mirror images. But what you find is, if you were to look at the celebrities, the Ryan Goslings, the Angelina Jolies, like the people that most people would consider to be like the really attractive kind of celebrities, what you see, if you fold their faces in half, they are very symmetrical from right to left. Yeah, which is a very odd thing to say. Like, well, why do you find this person attractive? Well, you have very average and symmetrical features. Probably not the best pickup line, but the research in psychology suggests that it's true. Another way that you like somebody is simply due to similarity. I referenced this earlier, but I really want to come back to it. It is this maxim that is so true in social psychology. It's that similarity breeds liking. Similarity breeds liking. And this can be things like realizing that you guys both like the same basketball team, or you guys both like the same type of ice cream, or you guys both went to the same school or chose the same major. The more similarities you have in common with somebody, the more you tend to like that person. And what's mind-boggling is some of these similarities can be superficial things. Just learning that someone has the same birthday as you like that person more than someone has a different birthday than you. Learning that someone has the same shoe size as you like that person more. So similarity breeds liking. which creates this sort of matching hypothesis that similar partners tend to choose other similar partners. And you see this matching phenomenon, this matching hypothesis play out even in physical characteristics. On a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being really attractive people, 1 being very unattractive people, you tend to find 10s partnering with other 10s, and 8s partnering with other 8s, and 5s partnering with other 5s. Not always, right? But you tend to find this high correlation such that similarity breeds liking. The same way you are more likely to date and hit it off with someone who also goes to college, or who has graduated college and shares the same value as you, is because that similarity that you guys have in experience and values creates liking. And in fact, that is one of the 2 biggest predictors of the Match.com and eHarmony algorithm of how would you even play matchmaker and bring people together. The first piece is proximity. You are more likely to hit it off and like people who live near you. So you're more likely to become friends with people who live on your same college dorm room floor, a few doors down from you, than someone who lives a floor up or floor below you, because you have more chance to interact with them. You're more likely to like and fall in love with someone in this class that you used to see like over and over and over again in class, right? That proximity. You're more likely to hit it off with someone at APU than at Citrus, right? Because that proximity of who you're likely to interact with. The second and really important predictor of that Match.com algorithm is similarity. So they'll give you a personality test and they'll ask you what your core values are. And what they'll do is they'll pair you up with someone whose values, especially core values, match or align really closely with your own. That's it. Proximity and similarity in values are the ways that a lot of these dating apps out there are pairing people together. Others like Tinder and more like kind of picture-based apps are probably looking more at like average and symmetry and more of that kind of hookup culture and like physical attraction. But the more Match.coms and eHarmonies, the one that are looking more for like lifelong love, are looking at proximity. You're more likely to hit it off with someone who lives near you, and similarity in values. You're more likely to hit it off with someone who shares your value for education or faith or your family or creativity or psychology or whatever is really important to you. So what I used to do is demonstrate this matching hypothesis by asking 20 students to come up to the front of the classroom and giving them a number that they'd put on their head between 1 through 10, and then asking them to kind of go around and stick out their hand and try and partner with someone that was the highest match that they could possibly get. And what you find is that 10s tend to partner with 10s and 9s tend to partner with 9s and stuff like that. So I've included a YouTube video of a social psychologist doing the same sort of activity, and they have microphones on people going through this sort of activity, where they find that even when you don't give people numbers on their heads that kind of correspond to their mate value, how attractiveness they'd be as a partner, you find the same sort of thing, is that attractive people tend to partner with other attractive people. But not always, right? There's some people that have a higher fear of rejection and kind of marry the first person that they date kind of thing. Or there's some that are more picky. For instance, I might wait longer and slip and things like that. So anyway, it's a cool activity. I wish I could do it in class, but the next best thing is to watch this video. And it's really analogous to high school and college when you're trying to navigate this intimacy versus isolation crisis of finding love. When I was talking about the matching hypothesis, it works for physical attractiveness, it works for values, but when you start looking at couples in the real world, you tend to find couples that match on attractiveness and values and income and things like that, but not always, right? We tend to find some couples out there that differ in age. That's very uncommon. Most couples are within 3 years of each other. Most married couples tend to be within 3 years of each other. such that I think the average marrying age is 28 for men and 25 for women. And the percentage of couples that are older than 10 years, like a 10-year age gap, is really, really small. So it's not common to date someone much older or much younger than you, which really supports this sort of matching hypothesis. So you might ask why. Well, why would some people marry someone much more attractive than them or much older than them? And what you find is when people start dating, they bring so much more to the table besides just their age, or besides just their income, or besides just how attractive they are. They have their personality and their friends and their family, like that social network that comes along with them, their values and their hobbies and their creativity and all these sort of things that kind of factor into how much of a catch they are, right? What social psychologists would refer to as their mate value. And what you find is people tend to do this sort of kind of balancing act. Well, if this person is like really old, it might be less attractive, but they have a lot of money, or this person is really young, that might be seen as this kind of equitable kind of match. But the takeaway here is that different couples are less likely to form and last. What you tend to find is more of a kind of matching hypothesis when it comes to age and attractiveness and values. So similarity breeds liking, which is kind of ironic when you ask grandma or your parents, you know, like, who should I hit it off with? And they say things like opposites attract. False. Like, social psychology does not bear that out. Opposites do not attract. Dissimilarity breeds repulsion. If you're introverted and she's extroverted, you know, you might go to mom and say, yeah, like we balance each other out. She's the yin to my yang and we complement each other so nicely. It sounds good until you get to Friday night. It's like, hey, what do you want to do? The extrovert wants to go out and the introvert doesn't. And it leads to conflict over time. So dissimilarity leads to repulsion. The maxim here is that similarity draws people together and makes them last. So hopefully you can apply a lot of that research on social relationships. And if you have questions about dating and relationships, I'm not going to tell you who to date or who to break up with or anything like that. Don't put that pressure on me. But if you have any questions about the social psychology of relationships, I would love to chat with you. And hopefully during our next lecture review, this should be like a lively kind of fun time. Yeah, that's, of all the things about social psychology, this is my favorite, is that it is so applicable to everyday life, on how you think about people, why do you do the things that you do, versus why do you like some people and dislike others. It's totally biased, but social psychology is awesome, and psychology is a fantastic field because of it. Next thing I want to talk about is social organizations, like groups that we belong to. Within these social organizations and groups, you might find that there's social roles that people experience. And you have to be really careful by having that label of like being called a judge. Stepping into that role will change your attitudes and change your behavior. You used to think, well, I could never see myself as a parent, right? Well, I've always been really like confident and kind of narcissistic and really ambitious. And like, I could never see myself just pausing and being selfless and worrying about my kids' best interest more than myself. Well, put you in that role. Notice how your life will change. Your attitudes and behaviors will do a 180 once you're in that role. The same way my sister was always like a loving, cool sister. And then as soon as my parents would leave and they'd say, all right, like you're now babysitting, you're in charge, she would turn into this kind of drill sergeant, kind of a jerk. It's like, notice how their attitudes and behaviors changed with that role that they were in. And all of us have so many different roles, so many different social identities that we jump back and forth between all day long. But notice that we're in different contexts. We're wearing different clothes. We're speaking differently. We're behaving differently. Our sense of self literally changes. Our attitude and behaviors change given the different roles that we're in. And this can be nightmarish. This can have a very good side, but also a bad side. And the bad side was demonstrated in one of the most unethical social psychology studies you will have ever heard of. It was conducted at Stanford University by Philip Zimbardo. It was called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And Philip Zimbardo really wanted to show how much you can change people's attitudes and behavior just by changing the role that they were assigned to. So what Philip Zimbardo did is he wanted to create a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building. So the psychology building was kind of set up like, oddly enough, the psych building in WIN, where when you walk down, you see like all the faculty hallways. They all had that sort of doors and chairs and things in there, like look like an office. So what Philip Zimbardo did is he wanted to create a mock prison on Stanford's campus in the basement of the psychology building. So he took all the doors out, took all the chairs out, put little fake, prison-like beds in there, put bars on the window. So he created this fake prison, and he wanted to populate it with college students, right, participants from the SONA system, and he wanted to randomly assign them to be one of two roles. Philip Zimbardo assigned half the people to be prison guards, and the other half he randomly assigned them to be prisoners. And he wanted to run this study for 2 weeks and just see what happens, see how their attitudes and behaviors change as a function of what group that they're in. So Philip Zimbardo, before he even started the study, he gave every psychology participant, potential participant, this battery of personality tests to make sure no one was really sadistic or had a history of anxiety or anything else. Gave them a battery like mental health test to make sure no one was like a closet psychopath or had like really severe depression or anything like that. So took people and tried to create the folks that were just the most kind of like average kind of baseline group of people that weren't sadistic, that weren't really neurotic, didn't have any mental health issues or anything like that. And what he did is he randomly assigned half of them to be the prison guards like this, where for the study, he said, all right, on Monday morning, I want you to show up for work as a prison guard. I've converted this building. The Stanford prison is now yours to rule. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of guidance. Your job is just to make sure that the prison keeps running. So he gave them glasses that hid their eyes. They had those kind of like stunner shades, kind of feel where like you couldn't see the person's eyes. You would just see a reflection of you looking back. They're kind of stereotypical what cops wear. He gave them a uniform, right? And he gave them a billy club to kind of make them feel like you're a prison guard. Here's your uniform, your outfit. For the prisoners, he said, all right, you've been assigned to this role. I want to feel real for you. So I want you to go home back to your apartment, back to your dorm room, just like hang out around home like you normally would. And then Philip Zimbardo sent the Palo Alto Police Department, right, the police around Stanford, to their homes. They knocked on their door, put them in handcuffs, put them in the back of their squad cars, brought them down to the Palo Alto Police Department, took off their clothes, took their mugshots, took their fingerprints, and drove them to the Stanford prison experiment. Again, to really make it feel like you are a prisoner. They took their hats, they took their clothes, they took any sort of individuating information that made it clear, like, this is Bob. No longer Bob, this is prisoner 8612 or 17. So kind of robbed them of all those sort of individuating characteristics. Now they're just a number. Now they're just another prisoner. And that was it. These prisoners and prison guards were in the same gen psych class a week before, but now they're in this realistic fake prison. And the first night went fine, right? The prison guards are saying, all right, 10 o'clock, lights out. And a lot of prisoners are like, okay, I guess it's my job to go to bed now. Except for a couple prisoners were like, really? Really, Bob? It's like, first of all, my name's not Bob, it's Mr. Correctional Officer. no, seriously, Bob, like you sat next to me in gen psych class. Like, I know who you are. Like, I don't go to sleep at 10 o'clock. Why are you turning off my lights right now? Like, well, that's because the prison goes to sleep at 10 o'clock. That's the rule that I set. And they started realizing is that a couple of the prisoners weren't going along with instructions. So it created this kind of dynamic of like, how can we quell this? How can we stop this before it turns into something bigger? So they started saying, well, if you aren't going to do what I want, then drop down and give me 10 push-ups. Ooh, 10 push-ups. And what they quickly started realizing on the coming up second, third day is that some of the prisoners weren't falling into their roles. They weren't following orders the way that they were supposed to. And if you remember, that's the only order that Zimbardo gave, is that your job as prison guards is to make sure that the prison functions. That was it. So what they started doing is saying, you know what? Everyone out of their cells, this prisoner, 8617, isn't following instructions. Everyone drop and give me 100 push-ups. So now notice how they started to get a little bit more creative in the punishment. They start engaging in group punishment as a way of deterring one group member's disobedience. That night comes around again. All right, 10 o'clock, lights out. And the prisoner's like, seriously, Bob, I'm not going to bed right now. All right, everyone out of their cells, 100 push-ups. Prisoner 8617 is still sitting there saying, nope, I'm not doing it. I don't care how many push-ups they do. Even though they were like using the group against them. And then what the prison guards realized is they had to start ratcheting it up a little bit. They started getting more and more creative. They started saying, you know what? Every single thing in your dorm room is a privilege. Like in that prison cell, that's a privilege. Your pillow, I'm taking it. No pillow tonight. Ooh, what am I ever going to do sleeping without a pillow? That mattress, that bed, that's a privilege. I'm taking it out. Okay, I guess I'll sleep on the floor. That toilet that is in your bathroom, that is also a privilege. And what you found is after a couple of days, the prison guards were taking out the pillows and the beds, taking out the toilets, making some prisoners that were disobedient defecate in buckets and clean the buckets with their own hands. For the prisoners that were still being really disobedient, they would put them in solitary confinement and engage in new kind of creative punishments and figure like what is going to work to change their behavior. And what you found is there was a lot of unrest. Some prisoners started having like panic attacks and really bad anxiety and really stressed out by being in the situation. And some of these prison guards became really sadistic. And this was especially true in the middle of the night shift, when the prison guards were stuck to watch the prison and they would get bored. And what you would find is some of these prison guards here's some more pictures of a prison guard and a prisoner. They would ask the prisoners to come out of their rooms, put bags on their head, because it was easier to discipline them when they couldn't see their face. Notice how de-individuating this is. This isn't Bob anymore. This is prisoner 8617, not wearing clothes like Bob used to wear, not even being able to see Bob's face like he used to. Bob can't even see your face because you're looking into these glasses where you can't see this humanness of someone's eyes. Notice that it's so much easier to aggress against someone when they're in a de-individuated state. Here's some more pictures of the social punishment, isolating a few folks. At one of the night shifts, you had prison guards really trying to get compliance by pulling out all of the prisoners and having them recreate the Bride of Frankenstein. So one prisoner was assigned the role of Frankenstein, walking over, and the other prisoner was assigned the role of the Bride of Frankenstein. And the prison guard would make these two prisoners kiss in recreating this Bride of Frankenstein moment. This really kind of like homophobic behavior, which is so above and beyond the lines of what any prison guard should be doing, right? It's not effective. It's creative and cruel and sadistic and mean, for lack of a better word. And all of that stuff, the worst of the worst, tend to happen at night when there's a lack of oversight, when there are fewer other folks around. This study was supposed to last a couple weeks. It was called short, I believe, after 4 or 6 days, when some of the prison guards started having panic attacks and started breaking down. Philip Zimbardo realized that the study had gotten way out of hand, way too quick. People are putting bags on their heads, solitary confinements, forced defecating in buckets, kissing other men, and forced to kiss other men in The Bride of Frankenstein. It just got way out of hand too quick. So Philip Zimbardo called the study. And this terribly unethical study became this very popular example of just how you can take anybody, any college student, no history of sadism or psychopath or anything like that. You put them in a situation, give them this role to be the prisoner and the prison guard, and just look how much it can change them. You can change their attitudes, you can change their behavior into incredibly submissive prisoners having panic attacks versus to cruel and brutal, sadistic prison guards just in a couple of days. So that was a really damning study, and it did a really nice job. The reason why it's so popular and gets brought up over and over and over again, and there's movies about it on Netflix called The Experiment and the Stanford Prison Experiment, is because it shows the power of the situation over people. If you don't remember any other line from this entire lecture, social psychology is all about the power of the situation. So a few years went by, right? Quite a few years. I think that study happened in the late 1960s. Shortly after the war in Iraq, after September 11th, President Bush had sent troops to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were trying to find the terrorists. They're trying to find what's his name, Osama bin Laden. And you had prison guards. You had U.S. soldiers manning prisons, taking what they were believed to be suspected terrorists, and they were watching over them, right, making sure that they couldn't plan any potential terrorist attacks. Even though not all of these members were terrorists, they were suspected terrorists. Maybe they could have been or might have known something. It was really ambiguous. And they held them at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. And then all of a sudden, the US media starts airing some of these pictures that were being leaked from the prison. And I apologize, these pictures are grotesque and brutal. They were aired in the US news, and they show a real clear similarity between what happened in Abu Ghraib and what happened in the Stanford Prison Experiment. We start seeing pictures of US soldiers, and you're like, is that a rope or a belt she has around like a prisoner's neck, and the prisoner's naked? Right? Why remove this person's clothes? Why publicly humiliate them this way? Why find this new sort of creative way to be cruel? You saw the same sort of thing with bags on the head, in this case, hoods over this person's heads, forced torture, forced to stand on a small box for extended periods of time, electrocution, trying to extract information of like, what might this person potentially know? Psychologists do not get involved in torture and coercion techniques whatsoever. It's a real clear kind of APA line that psychologists don't cross, because a lot of the information that you would receive in this sort of situation wouldn't be accurate. Then we start seeing these pictures, and it's like fear, removing people's clothes, public humiliation, and a lot of these atrocities were occurring in the night shift, where there's a lack of oversight. You start seeing pictures of U.S. soldiers, including the leader, Chip Frederick, of prisoners, no clothes on, bags on their head, forced to kind of like jump on top of each other as a big pile, and they have smiles on their face. And it's tempting to create the fundamental attribution error and say, well, why is this person smiling? They must be sadistic. They must be some sort of psychopath. That's why they're doing things like this, like Chip Frederick. When these photos aired, Philip Zimbardo and social psychologists everywhere saw the similarities, right? The same sort of behaviors that were occurring in Abu Ghraib were the exact same sort of behaviors that were occurring in Stanford prison experiments so many years before. Lack of roles, lack of oversight, lack of clear instruction of what you're supposed to be doing. Amplify that with the pressure of they might be designing some sort of terrorist attack that could hurt you, your friends, or your family. And you create all these social conditions where you can bring about the absolute worst in people. So it's not, oh, look at Chip Frederick, look how evil he is, right? Some, sadist, psychopath. Don't commit the fundamental attribution here, right? Remember that the situation is powerful, that the situation can cause people, just being in that role, changes people's attitudes, changes people's behavior to do things that they wouldn't normally otherwise do. So this is Philip Zimbardo meeting with Chip Frederick afterwards. Philip Zimbardo served as an expert witness at Chip Frederick's trial, where he was kind of court-martialed, dishonorably discharged from the military. And the US military's explanation was, well, Chip Frederick was a bad apple, right? Disposition. There's something unique about his personality that was really bad. But Chip Frederick wasn't the only one doing things like this, right? You see other people in this condition. What Philip Zimbardo and what social psychologists would argue, it's not the bad apple, it's not their personality, it's the bad barrel. If the barrel is bad, any apple that you put within it is going to become bad. It's the power of the situation that you have over other people. So there's a lot of other studies of attitudes and behaviors and the influence and roles that people have. And since we're talking about incredibly unethical, rough, brutal, bad studies that highlight the absolute worst in human nature, let me share with you another. This was conducted by Stanley Milgram, who was a social psychologist that right after World War II was watching TV, and you started watching the Nuremberg war trials. So you had Nazi soldiers and Nazi scientists being tried for war crimes. And the rest of the world was just seeing the full scope of what was happening. How many, I think it was like 11 million or more, like millions and millions of Jews and gays and gypsies and any sort of like group that was perceived to be as less than or non-Aryan was massively exterminated. They were shot, they were starved to death, they were buried in mass graves, they were forced to march into concentration camps where they would be put into gas chambers and euthanize all of them. And you had people across the globe looking in the faces of these Nazi soldiers and scientists and saying things like, how could you ever do such a thing? They were trying to make an attribution. How could those Germans ever do such a thing? Notice that they started rushing to, well, those Germans, they must have an authoritarian personality where they love the military and really value strict obedience to a strong authority figure. Those Germans. They were committing the fundamental attribution error by blaming other people's personality on their disposition, right, their personality, and forgetting about the power that the situation has over people. So Stanley Milgram said, you know what? As a social psychologist, I think the situation had a bigger role. I bet anybody, when put in a situation when an authority figure tells you or orders you to kill another human being, that they would follow through with that order. So Stanley Milgram conducted a really clever but dark study on obedience to authority figure, specifically whether people would obey authority figures to the point where they would actually kill another human being. So what Stanley Milgram did is he used deception in this study. So he misled participants. He sent out a call to members of Yale University and other folks in the local community and said, hey, I need volunteers for the study on learning. The study wasn't about learning. It was about obedience to authority. But he used deception, right? He told people, hey, this study is about learning. Specifically, I want to study the effect of punishment on learning. So what Stanley Milgram said is, in this study, you're going to have the researcher, right? Someone in a white lab coat kind of running the study, and there'll be two participants. There wasn't two participants, there's really just one, but he lied, right? Use deception here. He said there were going to be two participants. One participant is going to be assigned the role of learner, and the other participant is going to be assigned the role of teacher. And in this study, we'll randomly assign people to these roles, and the teacher is going to be on one side of the wall, and they'll be reading off word pairs into a speaker, right? So the learner can hear. They'll be saying things like, all right, the word pair is green grass. And later on, they'll say, all right, is the word pair green car, green grass, green movie, or something like that. And if the learner gets the answer wrong, says green car, then it's the teacher's job to use punishment to see if that'll change the rate of learning. And the way that Stanley Milgram said that they would be punishing is by administering electric volts to the learner. They would be electrocuting the learner in increments of 15 volts, going from 15 volts all the way to 450 volts. So over here you have the kind of shock machine and the research assistant. And this is what the dynamic kind of looked like. Is over here you would have the authority figure, right? The researcher in a white lab coat kind of overseeing how things were going. Over here you would have the teacher, right? Who was reading the word pairs out loud and seeing if the learner on the other side was answering correctly. And if the learner got the answer wrong, the teacher's job was to say, nope, I'm sorry, the answer, it should have been green grass. And if the learner got the answer wrong, then they would administer a shock of 15 volts, and then 30 volts, and 45 volts. They would keep going up in intensity for every wrong answer that the learner got. And at the beginning of the study, the authority figure took over, or like brought the teacher and the learner over and showed them, hey, this is what 15 volts feels like. Bzz, like it shocks you, like it gets your attention. And in this study, we'll be going up in every 15 volt increments all the way up to 450 volts if need be. So in this study, after Stanley Milgram described what was going on, the authority figure would rig it. So you had one participant who was naive, who didn't know what was going on, which is like a true participant from the community, and another participant who was just pretending. This person is a Confederate, what they call like an actor. They were in on it, and they rigged the study so that the naive participant was always assigned the role of teacher, right? They'd pull a number from, from a jar, and it was rigged so it would always come up that the naive participant was the teacher, and the learner, right, the person who was ostensibly receiving the electric shock, was the actor. And the actor over here would purposely get the answers wrong just to see how far the teacher would go up on this shock machine. And it's also important to note that at the beginning of the study, it looked like the actor was really strapped up to this machine, but was later disconnected. So no one ever really received a shock here. But the teacher certainly thought that they were. The teacher thought that they were going to electrocute another human being for every wrong answer that they gave. And this is what the shock generator looked like. Here's a picture of it. You can see the little levers that the teacher would have to press down every time that the learner got the answer wrong. You can see some labels down here. At the bottom, it said moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme shock, danger, XXX at the top. Like, who knows what that means, but it must be something really, really bad. And every time that the learner kept getting the answer wrong, they would start calling out through the wall. They would pretend to get shocked. Sorry, that's wrong answer, 15 volts. Bzz. And the learner would yell, ugh, for low shocks. And then later on would start saying, hey, this really hurts. That's all, get me out of here. I have heart trouble, get me out of here. Please, let me out. Let me out of here, let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out, let me out, let me out. So notice as the shocks get more and more intense, the reaction gets more and more extreme, saying, let me out of here. I have heart problems. Let me out of here. And then at around, I believe it's like 300 volts, silence. Why do you think this person who's just screaming, hey, hey, let me out here. This hurts. I have heart problems. You have no right to keep me here. I have heart problems. Let me out. All of a sudden stops responding. Probably because you killed that other person, right? Like, this is the assumption here. This person was complaining really vigorously, and all of a sudden now they stop. The assumption here is that you killed this other human being. If at any point the teacher said, I don't want to do this, they would turn to the authority figure, right? The man in the white lab coat standing behind them, and say, no, I'm done. And the experimenter would say, treat no response as a wrong response. Deliver the next highest level of shock. Or would say something like, the experiment requires that you continue. And if the teacher said, nope, seriously, like, that's it, I'm out of here, you can't hold me here anymore. If the teacher were to protest twice in a row, right? Saying, nope, I don't want to do this anymore. The experiment requires that you continue. Nope, I'm done. Two no's in a row would end the study right then and there. How far do you think you would go in this study? Well, they asked other psychiatrists, they asked another group of participants, and kind of described the same situation that I just gave to you. What do you think would happen? And what some people said is like, I wouldn't even start. So over here you have frequency of how many people said that they would like deliver 0 volts, meaning I wouldn't even do this study. Some people are saying like, hey, as soon as this person says, ouch, this really hurts, let me out, they would stop. A bunch of them said, hey, as soon as this person says like, I have heart problems, they would stop. And no one said that they would go no one said that they would go farther than 300. 300 is when this person stopped responding, where you think that you killed another human being. They asked psychiatrists and they said, no one is going to go all the way up to 450 volts. Well, that's why you run the study. You put people in this situation, you see what they will actually do. So here's the flyer that Stanley Milgram sent out. Notes here, people needed for a study on memory. No special training, education, or experience. We want factory workers, city employees, laborers, barbers, businessmen, clerks, professional people, telephone workers, construction workers, salespeople, white-collar workers. We want the average Joe. So they set it up where you had the person in the white lab coat would always kind of randomly assign it, so the actor, right, would always get assigned the role of learner, and the naive participant who was always assigned the role of teacher. And the whole point of the study was to really see how far the teacher would go on the shock scale. Would they go from 0 to 450 volts? And this is what they found. Yikes, right? Everyone started the study. There's nobody that said, nope, I'm not doing any study where it harm anybody else. Everyone did that. When the person started saying, ouch, hey, this really hurts, let me out, no one stopped. When the person went up and said, hey, I have a heart condition, let me out of here, let me out of here, let me out of here, no one stopped. Everyone kept going. The first person stopped at 300 volts, when they thought that they killed another human being when they stopped responding. 65% of people went all the way to 450 volts. Past moderate, past extreme, past danger, XXX, all the way to the end of the shock generator, which, if you don't know, 450 volts is absolutely enough to kill another human being. And in the study, they said, all right, keep going, 450 volts. Everyone kept going until 2 more turns after 450 volts. And then the experiment was like, okay, there's no stopping. People will obey authority. So remember the power of the situation. We like to think, well, those Germans, those people, they're obedient. They're authoritarian. They'll listen to, to Hitler, any cruel kind of Nazi leader. They'll be blindly obedient. No, people obey authority. Even Americans at Yale University, from the local community, the, the vast majority of people, 65% of people will shock another human being to 450 volts just because a man in a white lab coat said that the experiment required them to continue. That's terrifying. That is the power of the situation that it has on people. So the last thing I want to talk about is helping. And I wish I could end on a really happy note of why people are really helpful and they come to each other's rescue all the time. But unfortunately, the situation works on people in ways that adds time pressures and all sorts of reasons where people fail to offer help to those in need. So again, as a social psychologist, it's important to realize the power of the situation that can bring out the best or the worst in us. So it's important to know what's going on here with helping. So let me share a little bit about helping behavior. And one of the biggest backstories that led to two really instrumental studies on helping started with this woman right here. Her name is Kitty Genovese. She was a bartender in New York, and she was working the bar late night, hot summer New York night. It was a busy bar. Right across the street and right next door, there were a bunch of apartment complexes, a bunch of people out. In fact, Kitty Genovese lived maybe 200-300 feet from the bar, just like a short, very, very short walk from her apartment to the bar that she would work at. So Kitty Genovese is working, and this guy comes up to her, starts kind of hitting on her, starts, pushing, starts to like probe into her, starts wanting more than Kitty Genovese wants to have with this person, and says, no, thanks, like, I'm not interested, please stop talking to me. And keeps pushing and keeps kind of coming after Kitty Genovese, and she makes it really clear, like, I'm not interested. The man was a serial rapist and serial killer in the area that the police were having a hard time tracking down. And after Kitty Genovese had kind of rebuffed his overtures all night long, the guy left. He waited till 3 a.m. when the bar shut down, and he waited until Kitty Genovese left the bar and walked out from the bar to her apartment complex, a couple hundred feet down. So it's early in the morning. It's a hot summer night in New York. All of the neighbors have the windows open, right? So when Kitty Genovese gets off of her night shift, she can see a lot of the lights on in her neighbors' apartment complexes. She can hear them playing music. She can hear them talking. She can see them in the windows, and a lot of them have the windows open because it's so incredibly hot that night. So when Kitty Genovese leaves the bar, she sees this guy, and she's like, no, seriously, not interested. The guy rushes Kitty Genovese and stabs her in the stomach. And Kitty Genovese screams bloody murder. Help, help, help. Somebody help me. I've just been stabbed. The guy who stabbed her sees even more of the lights turn on in her neighbor's apartments, right? He sees, people look out and see Kitty Genovese bleeding there on the sidewalk, screaming, I've just been stabbed, someone help me. So the guy runs away, and Kitty Genovese is now crawling to her apartment. No one's coming out to help. After an hour of Kitty Genovese crawling, bleeding to her apartment complex door, screaming, asking for any of her neighbors to help her, the serial killer and rapist sees that no one's coming. So comes back over, takes Kitty Genovese into the alcove, and finishes murdering her as she screams out for help. A terrible story. The next day, the police come, they find Kitty Genovese's body there, and they interview the neighbors. And they say, hey, did you hear anything? Yeah, she was screaming bloody murder. She said she needed help. And the police asked, why didn't you offer any help here? Oh, I thought someone else had already called. I thought she was okay. I wasn't really sure what was going on. And the next day, the New York Times publishes an article that comes out and it says, Kitty Genovese fatally murdered, hundreds of neighbors hear her and do not help. And social psychologists are thinking, well, is it like those New Yorkers? Is it their personality? No. Don't commit the fundamental attribution error here. There must be some sort of power of the situation. There must have been something going on socially that caused people not to help. So Darley and Watson, a couple social psychologists, found two potential psychological mechanisms, like two potential reasons why people will see someone getting murdered or in need of help, but not always offer to call the police or go down there and see if this person's okay. The first reason I want to talk about is diffusion of responsibility. Imagine if you're waiting for the trolley to go over to, to West Campus or something like that. It's you standing there and just one other person there is waiting for the trolley. And all of a sudden you're sitting there waiting for the trolley and the person next to you just falls over. Looks to have some sort of heart attack or something going on. You're the only person there. How much responsibility to help falls on your shoulders? 100%, right? You're the only person there. No one else saw. 100% of the responsibility to call 911 is on your shoulders. But now let's imagine that you're there at the trolley waiting to go over to West Campus, and there's someone else sitting there next to you. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a few people sitting next to you. And all of a sudden, that person has a heart attack or some sort of emergency. They start convulsing. Now notice, because there's more people around you, the responsibility to help has now been diffused amongst the group, right? There's a diffusion of responsibility. Now, because there's 4 other people there, only 25% of the responsibility to help is on your shoulders. It could be, ironically enough, that the more people that are around, the less likely any individual is to receive help. That's referred to as this bystander effect, that the more people are around, the less likely any individual is to receive help. And it could be explained because of diffusion of responsibility. So to test this in a really creative way, Darley and Batson, this study was Darley and Latney. Anyway, not important because who cares what the psychologist names were. But anyway, Darley and Latney did the first diffusion of responsibility study. What they did is they brought participants into this room and they said, this is a study where we're gonna get you like to meet and greet other psychology majors just like you. So imagine kind of signing up for a SONA study, and you come in and they say, all right, what we're gonna do, we're gonna put you and another participant in a room, like an office room kind of right next door to you, and have you talk on the phone to this person, okay? So you think you're in there as this naive participant who doesn't know what's going on. You think that you're talking to another participant who's naive and doesn't know what's going on. But in fact, the other participant is actually Confederate. They're an actor who's trained, who knows what the study is all about. So in this sort of phone call, you're talking, you're saying, hey, how's it going? So you're a freshman at APU, how are classes and things like that. And the actor reveals, hey, actually things have been going really good, but to be honest, I was a little nervous at first. I was really nervous to leave home and go to college because I used to have a strong history of having these epileptic seizures. I would start convulsing uncontrollably, and it was like a medical emergency, and like these epileptic seizures would kind of come out of nowhere, and they were really scary and dangerous, but I haven't had any in a long time, so I've been really grateful nothing like that has happened. So the participant's like, oh, okay, well, I'm glad to hear it. So tell me about your classes. So anyway, you guys keep talking for a while. And then during the middle of this conversation, the actor's talking, and all of a sudden freezes. and starts convulsing, starts having a fake epileptic seizure, and you're talking to this person on the phone. Hello? Hello? Are you there? Are everything okay? You quickly realize, right, there's some emergency going on. 100% of the responsibility to help is on you. So what the social psychology researchers were doing is waiting to see, did you open that office door? Just to see, hey, does this person need help? And how long did it take you to open that office door and say, hey, are you okay? Or to at least run to the front or to the researcher and say, hey, I think there's something going on here. There might be some sort of emergency. Did you help, and how long it took you to help? The other half of participants were assigned to a condition where the responsibility to help was diffused. So they were one of these naive participants, right? But now, instead of being the only other person on the phone call, it's now like a conference call, right? There's a lot of other people in the hall, like in the offices right next door, and you're going around, yep, you're a naive participant, talking about what it's like being a freshman at APU or, things like that. And then the actor comes along and it says the exact same thing. Yeah, things are going really well, but to be honest, I was really nervous because I used to have a history of epileptic seizures. It would come out of nowhere. It was a really big deal, an emergency, and thank goodness I haven't had any in a long time. Yeah, that's good. You keep going around, sort of having these conversations. And then during this kind of conference call, all of a sudden that person has an epileptic seizure, drops the phone, starts convulsing into the phone, and it becomes apparent that, hey, there's some sort of emergency going on. And they recorded how long, or did any of the participants open the door to see, hey, are you okay? And how long did it take them to do so? So at this point, I often ask you to think, what would you do? If you were the only person present and the person you're talking to on the phone starts having an epileptic seizure, what percentage of you would help? Hopefully 100%. I'm assuming that's what you said. But in reality, only 85% of people helped. I wish it was 100%, but the vast majority, 85% of people at least opened their door. And they did so in an average of 56 seconds, less than a minute, which means that it took them a while, right? It took them a while of saying like, hey, wait, are you okay? Are you okay? Like, what's going on? Oh my gosh, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? It took them on average of 56 seconds before they opened the door. Right? I wish it was quicker, but anyway, at least they opened the door 85% of the time, and they did so on average in less than a minute. When multiple people are present, only 31% of the time did at least one person open the door. Meaning 69% of people sat in their room, didn't open the door, and carried on with that phone call. Only 31% of people helped. And of those 31% of people that helped, it took them on average about 3 minutes to make the decision to open the door. So this is the bystander effect. Ironically enough, when the more people are present, the less likely the person is to receive help when they're in need. And it takes them longer to receive help. And this can be explained by diffusion of responsibility. That when you have more people present, you start thinking around, well, maybe someone else called the police. Maybe someone else went and asked the researcher if this person was okay. I don't need to. I don't want to be, like a worry word. I don't want to be redundant. I don't want to have to call the police and be like, oh, you're the, second person that's called. But what happens is when you have more people around, you have more people thinking it's not my job. It's not my responsibility. Someone else will do it. The cruel irony is every other participant in the group is thinking the exact same thing. So when there are more people present, every individual is less likely to receive help, even though they drastically need it. And the same thing happened with Kitty Genovese. When you asked the neighbors in New York City, hey, did you see it? Yeah, totally. And I saw other neighbors too. And I assumed that they were calling the police. I didn't think that I had to. That's diffusion of responsibility. The other thing that was going on with Kitty Genovese that Darlene Latney have also looked at is social inhibition. That in Kitty Genovese's case, when they looked out their mirror, or when the neighbors looked out their window and they saw Kitty Genovese, they also looked out their window and they saw their other neighbors. And they saw them look out like, oh, yep, that's Kitty Genovese. Yep, she's hollering. And then they went back to doing their crosswords. They went back to watching TV. They went back to bed. And when you have these neighbors, these participants saying like, hey, what's going on? Is this a big deal or not? When people are trying to decide, is this an emergency? What should I do? They look to other people, right? They social reference, like what are other people doing in this situation? Are other people acting like this is an emergency? Are they yelling? Are they screaming? Are they calling 911? Are they rushing downstairs? Social inhibition argues that if you see other people not acting, you would be less likely to act as well, right? Socially, it would inhibit your own behavior. So it's not just that more people were present, the responsibility was diffused. When you look at other people not responding, that causes you to not respond as well. So to test this in a really creative way, social psychology researchers have asked participants to come into a study to do a survey about urban environments or some other fake kind of survey thing. And they say, okay, wait in this room, kind of like this, right? And in one condition, you'll be sitting there by yourself. In the other condition, you'll be sitting there in between two other people, right? Alone or in a group. And all of a sudden, while you're working on this survey, the room will start filling with smoke. This is fake smoke. The room isn't really on fire. But what the social psychology researchers are doing, they're pumping smoke into the room. And they're recording, hey, when did you first notice the smoke? As soon as you first notice the smoke, they're starting the timer to see how long does it take you to say, yeah, there's smoke in here. I should go tell somebody about it. Does that matter if you are the only participant in that room? Does it matter if there's other participants next to you? And in the third condition, they said, does it matter if you're in a room with other people next to you and they're not responding? So in this example right here, you have a naive participant in the middle and two actors off to either side. They're in on the study. Their job is to sit there and do the survey and act like this is no big deal, right? When the room starts filling up with smoke, start wafting the smoke away and keep working on the survey and just see how long it takes the participant to open the door and say, hey, there's an emergency. This room is filling up with smoke. There's a fire. What percentage of the time, if you are alone in this room, do you think the people would at least open the door and say, hey, I'm in a smoke-filled room? You wish it was 100%. It's actually 75. So I don't know why 1 out of 4 people sit in this room that's filled with smoke. But anyway, when you're the only one in there, the vast majority of the time, about 75% of people will run outside and say, hey, there's something going on. This room is filling up with smoke. When you're sitting in the presence of other people that are not responding, only 10% of the time will you leave. You notice the smoke. You notice the smoke, and you might even say to the person next to you, hey, do you see this? If they're nodding, like, oh, yeah, and keep working on their survey, 90% of the time you are sitting in that room as it fills with smoke. Only 10% of people are actually going to help. That's shocking, right? That's mind-boggling. That is the power of the situation. Well, which is funny because if you were to ask people, hey, what would you do in this situation? I would bet money that they would say, oh, I would help. I'm not a conformist. I'm an American. Like, if I see the room filling up with smoke, I'm going to see something. I'm going to say something. That is not the case. This is social inhibition. If you look around and you see the people next to you not reacting, you are not likely to react as well. That's the power of social inhibition, which is terrifying. So both of these things were happening in the Kitty Genovese case. both of these explain why she was unlikely to receive help. And I'm pointing out these now so you know. So you know how the situation impacts people, and you know how the situation can impact you, because you are people. You are going to be, hopefully not in an emergency situation, but if for some reason you are, I want you to remember these phenomena. I want you to understand this research on helping. So when you need help, you look to someone and you say, this is an emergency. You don't just say help, right? You don't just like give them a secret look and want them to call the police. You need to spell it out for them black and white. This is not normal. This is not a joke. This is not a prank. This is a serious emergency. And that way you cut the social inhibition. Because this was like, people were ambiguous. They weren't really sure. When you tell people this is an emergency situation, they know better. And then the other thing, instead of saying, someone help me, that's diffusion of responsibility, right? There's so many people there. What you need to do is cut that diffusion of responsibility and put 100% of the responsibility on one person. You there in the red shirt, I need you to call 911. This is an emergency. Those things will lead to help. So that's all I have for you for social psychology. A lot of really cool findings about attitudes and behavior and relationships and falling in love, but also some dark findings as well about how the situation that we're a part of can either bring out the worst or the absolute best in us. So I hope that you always remember the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram Obedience to Authority study, and the helping studies I touched on at the very end. They're classic findings, and they're so incredibly applicable to your life now and your life in the future. So if you have any questions at all or want to chat about social psychology, I'd love to hear from you. All right, see you, everybody.